Reading D.W. Griffith and the Origins of American Narrative Film, The Early Years at Biograph by Tom Gunning. Introduction. In 1940, a young filing clerk at the Library of Congress, whose interest in theater and literature made him consider his job as more than a menial task, found references to a series of paper films stored in a neglected vault of the library. Curious about what these copyright records were, Howard Lamar Walls went to the Librarian of Congress, the poet Archibald MacLeish, and requested the key. The vault's lock was discovered to be so corroded that the key was useless and the lock had to be removed. Once open, the vault revealed not only stacks of photographic stills, but also the rolls of paper films that had piqued Wall's curiosity. Examining a few rolls, he recognized names from the earliest periods of film history: Thomas Edison, American Mutoscope, and Biograph. What Walls rediscovered was a series of copyright documents of an unique sort. At the turn of the century, film was such a new means of expression that it was not covered by existing copyright legislation. However, film manufacturers, in particular Thomas Edison, very much desired the legal protection that copyright could give their productions, which otherwise could easily be copied and distributed by other companies. An Edison employee hit upon the idea of transferring every photographic frame of a film onto bromide paper and sending the resulting roll of paper to the Library of Congress, where it could be copyrighted as a still photograph. The clerk, who received the first such Edison submission, decided that there was no reason a photograph could not be 3/4 of an inch wide and 100 feet long, and duly recorded the copyright. Until 1912, when the copyright law was amended to include motion pictures, the creation and filing of, quote, paper prints, end quote, was the primary way motion picture companies legally protected their products. What were intended and preserved simply as legal records were recognized by Walls as unique historical and aesthetic documents. Because nitrate film stock, on which nearly all films were printed and photographed until the 1940s, had a volatile and short-lived chemical makeup, original prints of films from this period have largely disappeared. For many early films, including most of the films discussed in this book, these paper rolls are the only surviving versions. Walls, with the support of MacLeish and such interested government figures as Harry Truman, realized that he had material that could reconstruct the themes and methods of the beginning of American filmmaking. The task of making these paper records into projectable films was achieved by Kemp Niver with the support of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in the 1950s. Treating the rolls of dried and fragile paper and then rephotographing them onto 16mm film. Presently, the paper print collection is once again being photographed, this time onto 35mm film with greatly enhanced image quality. All history begins with traces, and these unusual legal documents on paper rolls form the primary basis of this book. In film history, as Michelle Lagney has pointed out, the traces, the films themselves, are the goal rather than the means of a reconstruction. However, historical investigation always transforms the traces it deals with as it tries to understand them, and film history is no such exception. Through the efforts of these men, the films were able to be projected, put into motion, and brought to life as the photographic records of men and women long dead, reanimating action performed and probably forgotten long ago. If I begin if I begin this introduction with this rather romantic and archetypal tale of the discovery of buried treasure, with its science fiction complement and Niver's resurrection of the dead material into the illusion of life through cinema, it is because I find it exemplary of the task of film history. Although the survival of the paper prints was a sine qua non for the recovery of every American film history, physical survival alone was not sufficient. It took the imagination of Walls to be able to see them differently, not as essentially useless legal records, but as the remains of films, and clear the way for their study as works of art and evidences of film history. History is never simply the surviving records of the past, but always a creative and imaginative act of trying to understand the past, a belief that it says something to us. This book derives from an ongoing curiosity about what these early films can tell us. The paper print collection includes a nearly complete run of the films made by the American Mutoscope and Biograph Company from 1900 to 1910, including nearly all the films directed by D.W. Griffith from 1908 to 1909, which formed the concern of this book. Study of this unique collection of film reveals, to paraphrase L.P. Hartley, that, quote, they made films differently then, end quote. These films demand our attention for both their alien qualities and those that seem familiar. This book tries to deal with those differences and similarities as revealed by the films themselves. This is also a book about change. The first 2 decades of film production in the United States, from its commercial introduction in 1894 to the triumph of full-length features in 1914, was one of almost continuous transformation. Toward the end of the period, from 1908 to 1913, David Wark Griffith directed nearly 500 one and two reel films for the American Mutoscope and Biograph, or as it were renamed in 1910, simply Biograph Company. These films have gathered through the decades a nearly legendary representation described by film historians as films that changed film history. According to this view, if American film came to age with D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, these films were the stages on the way to maturity. However, it is only recently that film historians have bothered to look at the films carefully. The pioneer historians, such as Terry Ramsey, Louis Jacobs, George Sadul and Jean Mitry, who studied the origins of narrative film before the availability of the paper print collection, relied almost entirely on written accounts of the films or on their own memories. Their descriptions of films are filled with inaccuracies because of the inadequate materials available to them. But contemporary historians are no longer in this position. Through the resources of the Library of Congress and the film archives at the Museum of Modern Art, all but a handful of the films Griffith made for the Biograph company are readily available for viewing. A number of scholars have made use of these films, notably Russell Merritt in his 1970 dissertation on Griffith's work from 1908 to 1915, Kemp Niver in his 1971 book D.W. Griffith, His Biograph Films in Perspective, and Roberta Pearson in her dissertation on performance style in Griffith's Biograph Films, and Joyce Jasanowski in her study of Griffith's dramatic structure, Thinking in Pictures. My focus is somewhat different from that of these scholars, although there is some overlap. To analyze the narrative structure of these films closely and to place them in a historical context. This context is both vertical and horizontal. On the one hand, I try to determine their place in relation to the development of narrative form in film history before Griffith, and on the other hand, I attempt to relate them to the transformations occurring in the film industry during their production. To allow close scrutiny of a number of films, I have restricted my work to the years 1908 to 1909, which I believe witnessed the greatest transformation in Griffith's narrative form, as well as an important upheaval in the American film industry. The creation of the Motion Picture Patents Company. But it is not only my use of the films themselves that separate this work from the pioneer approaches to Griffith's Biograph films. Concepts of both narrative structure and historical analysis changed radically in film study during the 1980s. Models of film history based on presuppositions of progress or a natural maturing process have been severely questioned. Likewise, investigation of the nature of film narrative has called for new theoretical precision. A new understanding of Griffith's Biograph films demands a whole new framework for thinking about film history and the way narrative operates in film. Both these tasks have been essential to my work. This work, therefore, includes a theory of film narrative which, although tailored to my needs in approaching Griffith's first Biograph films, discusses film narrative on a broader basis. My narratology is primarily based in thinkers that come out of the structuralist school, such as Tversky, Todorov, and Gerard Genette. Although the presence of a theoretical concern in what is essentially a historical work may seem dismaying to some readers, I consider it essential to a new understanding of the history of American narrative film. Too often, the nature of narrative is simply assumed in film history, or its discussion regulated to the theoreticians. I strongly believe that history and theory must proceed in tandem in film study, with the methods of one supplementing the undertakings of the other. The most fruitful place of fusion for these disciplines comes in an analysis of individual films, an analysis which is aware of both the historical nature of these films and able to use theoretical concepts to explore their structure. Therefore, it is the analysis of specific films that forms the center of my work. Viewed as historical objects and as structural complexes, these films are also understood as works of art, showing individuality and uniqueness as well as historical significance and theoretical functions. It was a fascination with Griffith's Biograph films that first drew me to this project, and I hope that history and theory will help to explicate that fascination rather than reduce it. For the reader familiar with recent work in film study, it is perhaps less my theoretical selection that may seem unfamiliar than my primary task, a historical investigation of the Biograph films. There is no question that film history has been a poor relation in the serious work undertaken in film study in the 1980s. Undoubtedly, this derives from the preference for synchronic analysis of text that the authority of the structuralist method brought to film study, and the consequent suspicion of the empirical methods and models of casualty associated with historical study. However, even within the structuralist movement, there has been a growing concern about the dangers involved in hermetically enclosing the text, and a recognition that the way a text operates involves a reference outside itself to processes of enunciation and reception. If film history remains underdeveloped in comparison to work in textual analysis and theory, it is partly because its tasks are awesome. To maintain the insights provided by structuralist analysis while at the same time exploring the individual text in relation to the other signifying systems of a culture may seem a process doomed by its delicacy on one hand and its scope on the other. American film study has seen a number of exemplary forays into the rethinking of film history. Two works are particularly noteworthy for their clarity and challenges. Film History, Theory and Practice by Robert C. Allen and Douglas Gormy, 1985, and The Classical Hollywood Cinema, Film Style and Mode of Production to 1960 by David Bordwell, Janet Stager, and Kristen Thompson, 1985. Both works are the fruit of collaboration and draw on nearly a decade of research by their respective authors. Although the dissertation on which my book is based was basically completed before the publication of these books, my work is fundamentally in concert with their attempt to introduce into film history some of the theoretical precision found in textual analysis. I share with these authors a belief that the analysis of film text needs to be founded historically, desperately needs, in Bordwell's words, quote, to specify the historical conditions that have controlled and shaped textual processes, end quote. It is my hope that this work can help establish a new defined project for film history, one which includes an understanding of the historical context of film production and a close analysis of the films themselves. One of the first tasks of the film historian must be the construction of a historical succession of styles. In the fifth thesis of his discussion of literary history, quote, literary history as a challenge to literary theory, end quote, the literary theorist and historian Hans Robert Joss declares, quote, one must insert the individual work into its, quote, literary series, end quote, to recognize its historical position and significance in the context of the experience of literature, end of quote. This task has long been recognized in the histories of other art forms, but has been strangely ignored in film history, largely because filmic discourse has only recently been subjected to close scrutiny. Further, the discussion of early film history has been dominated by a model of the progressive attainment of a natural cinematic language, which was understood as existing ahistorically. A historical succession of art styles bases itself in transformations. It is the transformation represented by the films made by Griffith from the Biograph company from 1908 to 1909 that will be discussed herein. The films will be placed in appropriate historical series demonstrating primarily how they are different from the films that preceded them and, to a lesser extent, how they relate to the films that followed them. Although I am deliberately dealing herein with a rather small slice of historical time, although a large number of films, Griffith directed more than 200 films in these 2 years. A historical treatment of the period involves consideration of the decade of film history that preceded it, as well as anticipating the move into feature filmmaking in the decade that followed. The brief period negotiates an enormous transformation between the two periods on either side of it. The crux of this transformation lies precisely in Griffith's approach to narrative form. While the legendary approach to D.W. Griffith portrays him as an inventor of cinematic techniques, most frequently of the close-up and occasionally of parallel editing. Even pioneer historians such as Louis Jacobs, George Sadal, and Jean Mitry were aware that Griffith introduced no new techniques to filmmaking. What then was Griffith's contribution? From Terry Ramsay through to Christian Metz, historians and theorists have agreed that Griffith was instrumental in a transformation of how films told stories. Therefore, a theoretical treatment of narrative proves essential to an investigation of this claim. It is necessary to determine the functions of narration in film in order to determine precisely exactly what transformations occurred during 1908 through 1909. In defining Griffith's film narration, I will also differentiate it from the narrative styles of the films that precede film, and theoretical definitions will allow the construction of a historical succession of styles. Therefore, an essential aspect of this work is not only revising the concept of Griffith's early Biograph films, but also the understanding of the films that preceded that preceded Griffith. Here, again, contemporary historians are in a better position than their forebears. Although the films made before 1908 that have survived by no means represent a complete sample, the paper print collection and recent efforts by the Film Archives of the International Federation of Film Archives, FIAF, have not only preserved a large number of early films, but have also labored to make them accessible to scholars. We now have a better sense than ever before of the cinema that preceded Griffith. This new availability of films has been matched by a re-examination by a number of scholars, including Andre Gudralt, Ben Brewster, Miriam Hansen, Kristen Thompson, Charles Musser, Eileen Bowser, Barry Salt, John Gartenberg, and Noel Birch. They have overturned simplistic understandings of pre-Griffith cinema as a primitive period limited to a simple reproduction of either reality or theoretical performance. Early cinema can now be understood, and it was primarily Birch who pioneered this understanding as not simply an elementary stage of cinematic revolution, the infancy of an art form, but as a period that possessed a different conception of space, time, and narrative form from the way in which these issues were approached in the later classical cinema. I maintain that early cinema did not see its main task as the presentation of narratives. This does not mean that there were not early films that told stories, but that this task was secondary at least until about 1904. The transformation that occurs in films around 1908 derives from reorienting film style to a clear focus on the task of storytelling and characterization. In this work, I will describe the move from what I call a, quote, cinema of attractions, end quote, which was more interested in the display of curiosities, to a cinema of narrative integration, which subordinates film form to the development of stories and characters. It is this move to a cinema of narrative integration that Griffith's first films exemplify. At the same time, my concern with narrative form in these Biograph films does not exhaust the historical horizons of this work. This transformation from a cinema of attractions to one of narrative integration does not rest simply on the interior form of these films. The years 1908 to 1909 witnessed a radical reorganization of the American film industry. These two transformations are interrelated. Just as my treatment of the filmmakers who preceded Griffith will modify claims for his innovative force, so considerations of the production context for his Biograph films will limit viewing him as the unique source of these transformations. Changes in the film industry brought new conceptions of the film as commodity and of the sort of audience for whom films were made. These new conceptions had direct impact on Griffith's films. My historical investigation of the Biograph films, therefore, involves integrating these films from a number of angles. Although these angles are distinguishable, it is the way they converge in the individual films that fascinates me. Therefore, the greatest part of this narrative is accorded to a close examination of the films themselves, including a discussion of their aesthetic forms. But alongside this, quote, interior, end quote, treatment of the films, I will investigate the context of their production, their existence as industrial products, and the economic and industrial changes and strategies that shape them. Such events of industrial history as the formation of the Motion Picture Patents Company and the Biograph Company's position in this industrial organization redefined the nature of the film commodity. The context of these films' production directly relates to another context, that of their reception, their methods of exhibition, the makeup of their audiences, the way they were reviewed and discussed in the trade journals, and how they were viewed by the political reformers who turned their attention to films around this time. The ways films were received were shaped in part by the way producers defined their commodities, and in turn, producers were influenced by the reception films received from various segments of American society. And both these elements inflected the interior forms of the films themselves. Although one of my purposes is to show the interrelation among these three areas, the films, the industry that produced them, and the society that received them, they do not form a strictly interlocking pattern in which one area fully explains or determines another. Avoiding both a purely aesthetic investigation of the films, such as Jazmine or a narrowly determinist historical approach, I hope to develop a topology in which each area exerts pressure on and encounters responses from the others. I maintain that D.W. Griffith's filmmaking is not simply the result of an inspired genius, but rather a response to a series of pressures from the film industry and film's evolving role in American society. At the same time, Griffith's place within a historical series of film style reveals both his inheritance and transformation of the relatively brief but remarkably vital stretch of film history that preceded him. Although in some ways the forms he used were shaped by forces beyond his creation, nonetheless, Griffith's response, the films he directed, have the uniqueness and ultimately the inexhaustible nature of individual works of art. Working from these surviving films' physically fragile but aesthetically powerful traces, a historical investigation of Griffith's films tries to understand them by showing the condition to which they respond. It is my belief that a full understanding of these conditions enriches the films rather than reducing them to pawns in an impersonal historical destiny. A careful penetration into their aesthetic forms likewise endows our historical understanding of the period with the relief and depth demanded by the ongoing fascination exerted by these images and stories from the beginning of our century. The fragility and ultimately the persistence of film history was brought home to me in a personal way as I completed this refashioning of my PhD dissertation into book form by the death of three men whose intellectual presence threads its way throughout. They were three of the finest film historians that this discipline is ever likely to see: J. Lada, Jean Mitry, and George C. Pratt. My work owes many debts to them, only a few of which are the sort that can be acknowledged in notes. Professor Lada was truly my mentor in undertaking this work, both as inspiration and as my dissertation advisor. What is valuable herein I owe to him. Mitry most frequently plays the role of noble opponent, the clearest and most valuable representative of a view of Griffith that I wish to modify. And although I never met Pratt, his personal encouragement of my work on Griffith and the world he opened by making me aware of the treasure trove of information available in trade journals shaped many of my conclusions. Equally important to my personal sense of debt is my sense of the awesome legacy these men left a new generation of film historians. They also, or they are some of the last historians for whom early cinema was still a living memory and not simply an archival experience. I know what this work owes to their passion and their wisdom. I hope it can continue. I hope it can continue their mastery of the historian's task to renew and rediscover the images of the past. And I was reading the introduction to D.W. Griffith and the Origins of American Narrative Film, The Early Years at Biograph by Tom Gunning.